The wind came down from the Black Hills the night before they buried the empty coffin. Ingrid Thorvald stood at the edge of the small grave on the slope above Hollow Creek. She was holding the leash of a golden-haired dog who would not stop trembling. The dog's name was Copper. He had belonged to her husband. Now he belonged to no one but her. And even that felt uncertain. The coffin was the size of a bread box. Inside it, the Ashbrook family had told her lay her son Eli. Born too early. Gone before she could hold him. They had not let her see the body. They had not let her wash him. They had not let her say his name out loud. 24 years old. A widow for 6 weeks. A mother for less than a day. And now they said neither. The shovels worked fast in the cold ground. Cordelia Ashbrook stood in black silk on the other side of the grave. Her face was dry. Her hands were gloved against the October wind. Reginald Ashbrook stood beside his wife, watching the priest's mouth move without seeming to hear the words. Behind them, the entire town of Hollow Creek had come to watch. Not to mourn, to watch. Because everyone knew the story. The Norwegian girl. The poor Lutheran immigrant who had somehow tricked Magnus Ashbrook, heir to the largest copper claim in the Dakota Territory, into marrying her in Bergen 4 years ago. The girl who had returned to America on his arm with a foreign accent and a head full of strange ideas about how the earth could keep a house warm. And now she stood at the grave of a child the town did not believe had ever truly been hers. Copper pressed against her leg. Ingrid did not cry. She had not cried since the night they put the cold cloth over her face, and she woke up empty. When the last shovel of dirt fell, Cordelia walked around the grave. She leaned close. She spoke in a voice meant only for Ingrid's ear. "You are not an Ashbrook. You never were." Then she turned and walked down the hill, and the town followed her. Ingrid stood alone with the dog until the sun went behind the ridge, and in that long, cold silence she made a promise to her son's name, not to the body in the box, to the name itself. "I will not let them bury me too. If you're listening to this story tonight, I want you to do something for me before we go any further. I want you to think about a woman in your own life, a mother, a daughter, a sister, someone who was told she was nothing, someone who proved them wrong. Hold her in your mind, because what happens next in the Dakota winter of 1887 is for her. Hollow Creek, Dakota Territory sat in a shallow bowl between 2 ranges. The wind there had a personality all its own. Old men in the saloon called it the Long Whisper. It came down out of the north in October and did not stop until April. And it taught every roof in town the limits of what a roof could do. The town itself was 12 years old, built on copper, built on the Ashbrook claim. Reginald Ashbrook had arrived in 1875 with a wagon load of mining equipment and a wife from Boston who already knew the wives of 3 congressmen. Within 5 years, he owned the assay office, the bank, the lumber mill, and 3 of the 4 members of the town council. The 4th was Judge Mortimer Vance. He owed Reginald nothing in writing. He owed him everything in practice. Magnus Ashbrook had been their only son. Smart, strange. The kind of boy who carried books into the mine and came home with rocks in his pockets that he labeled with tiny handwritten tags. At 22, he announced he was going to Norway. He wanted to study with a Bergen mining engineer named Bjorn Halvorsen, who had written a paper Magnus had read 3 times. He came home 18 months later, married to Bjorn Halvorsen's granddaughter. Cordelia Ashbrook had not spoken to her son for the first 2 weeks after he came back. She had not spoken to Ingrid for the first 6 months. She spoke to her now only when the law required it. Ingrid had loved Magnus the way only a woman raised by her grandmother Astrid and her grandfather Bjorn in a stone house above a fjord can love. Her mother had died when Ingrid was 4. Her father had gone to sea 2 years later and had not returned. Astrid had raised her by the kitchen fire. Bjorn had raised her in the mines. Bjorn Halvorsen had taught Ingrid from the time she could walk. He had taken her into the mine shafts of the Bergen district when she was 7 and made her lie flat against the cold stone wall and feel through her cheek the deep, slow heat that lived in rock that had not seen the sun for 1,000,000 years. He had said to her in Norwegian fjelle puster lille jenta, "The mountain breathes. If you learn its breath, you will never freeze." She had carried that sentence across the ocean in her chest like a small lit candle. And when she came to Hollow Creek and saw how the people there built their houses square and tall and proud and bleeding heat into the sky every night, she had understood something about America that she could not yet say in English. These people were rich, and these people were cold, and they had confused the two. Magnus had understood. Magnus had been planning a different kind of house. She knew this because on the morning after his funeral 6 weeks ago, she had found his leather-bound journal in the bottom of his travel trunk. 47 pages of careful drawings, stone trenches, air shafts, heat curves measured in degrees Fahrenheit, and on the inside cover in Magnus's neat hand, "For Ingrid and the child. The house we will build at the Bone Hollow." The Bone Hollow was 3 acres of useless scarp land at the north edge of the town's territorial boundary, loose shale, a north-facing slope where nothing grew but stunted juniper, and at the top of the slope a black gash in the rock face that the local children called the Cold Mouth, because even on a July afternoon the air sighing out of it felt like death's own breath. The town considered it worthless. Magnus had purchased it for $40 2 years before he died. Ingrid did not yet know that. 3 days after the burial of the empty coffin, the town council called a hearing about Magnus Ashbrook's estate. The room smelled of pine sawdust and tobacco. Judge Vance sat in the center chair behind the long oak table. Reginald Ashbrook sat to his right, not on the council, but somehow at the table anyway. 3 other men filled the remaining chairs, men who owned the mill, the bank, and the lumber yard, which is to say men who owned Reginald Ashbrook's favors. Ingrid sat on a bench at the front of the room with Copper at her feet. The dog had not left her side since the morning of the burial. Vance cleared his throat. Mrs. Thorvald. Not Mrs. Ashbrook, not the widow Ashbrook, Mrs. Thorvald. Her maiden name, her foreign name. She did not look up. This council has reviewed the matter of Magnus Ashbrook's estate. We find that the marriage conducted in Bergen, Norway in 1884 was not properly registered with the Territorial Court of Hollow Creek. As such, you have no standing as Magnus's widow under Dakota law. The estate reverts in full to his parents. She heard Cordelia make a small, satisfied sound from the back of the room. However, Vance continued, the council is not without charity. We have deeded to you a parcel of land at the northern boundary. 3 acres, free and clear. It is yours. He gestured to a map pinned to the wall behind him. She did not need to look. She knew that map. Every soul in the valley knew that map. The Bone Hollow, the Cold Mouth, the grave they were handing her wrapped in ribbon and called a gift. She stood up. She took the deed from his outstretched hand. Her fingers did not linger. "Thank you," she said, because saying it cost her nothing. And it ended the conversation faster than anything else would. Then she walked out of the town hall with Copper at her heel. She was almost through the door when she heard it. From a bench in the back, where an old man sat with his hat pulled down low over his face, pretending to sleep. 5 words spoken at exactly the volume needed to reach her and no one else. Magnus knew that hollow. She turned. The old man's chest rose and fell in the slow, false rhythm of performed sleep. By the time she took her next breath, he was already moving. Sliding out a side door she had not noticed existed. She had seen him before. Silas Hawthorne, a miner, retired. He had worked the lower shafts of the Ashbrook claim back when Magnus was still in school. Magnus had spoken of him once. The only man in this town who reads the rock the way my grandfather does. She stepped out into the gray October morning with a deed for a graveyard in one hand and a question that had no answer yet in the other. If you've ever walked out of a room where powerful people just decided your fate without asking your name, you know exactly how Ingrid's feet felt on those wooden steps. Stay with me. The story is just starting to turn. Jasper Brennan was waiting on the porch of his father's general store across the street. He was 19, tall, still finding the shape of his own body. He had asked Ingrid to marry him twice in the months before Magnus came home from Norway. She had refused him twice, kindly the first time, less kindly the second. He had never forgiven her for the second. He pushed off the porch post as she passed. Ingrid, she did not stop. I heard about the council. Listen, my father has a room behind the store, warm, dry. You could stay there, work the counter a few hours a day to cover the cost. It's a fair deal. Copper growled low in his throat. She turned her head just enough to meet Jasper's eyes. No. She did not soften it. She did not explain. His smile held its shape. But something else moved behind it. The thing that had moved behind it the second time she had refused him. Pride doesn't keep widows warm, Mrs. Thorvald. He said it loud enough for the men coming out of the saloon to hear. She kept walking. Copper kept growling. And somewhere behind her ribs, the small lit candle her grandfather had left her flickered and held. That afternoon, she opened Magnus's journal at the kitchen table of the cabin she had 5 days left to live in. She had read it before. She had read it the night after the funeral, and again the night after the burial. But she had read it as a widow reads a dead man's writing, looking for him, looking for the voice, looking for the warmth of being known. She read it now as something else. She read it as a builder reads a plan. The drawing showed a trench cut into the floor of a cave, 40 feet long, lined with red sandstone and shale, sealed with clay. A firebox at one end, a chimney stack at the other set far back from the cave entrance. Hot gases would travel the full 40 feet underground, surrendering their heat to the stone, which would surrender it slowly upward through the floor. Like a great patient battery of warmth. The mountain remembers, Magnus had written in the margin. A fire at the mouth of a cave is waste. A fire deep inside with a long chimney teaches the smoke a lesson in generosity. She read it twice. Then she turned the page and found the diagram of the cave itself, and there in Magnus's hand was a sketch of the cold mouth at the bone hollow. He had measured it. He had measured every dimension of that cave. The width of the opening, the depth of the chamber, the angle of the crack at the back where the cold air seeped in. He had been there, many times. He had walked into the place the town called worthless, and he had seen the way her grandfather Bjorn had taught her father to see, and her father had taught her that a north-facing cave in a south-running ridge of red sandstone was not worthless at all. It was a furnace waiting for someone with the right kind of memory to light it. The deed in her pocket was not a death sentence. It was an inheritance delivered by the wrong hands for the wrong reasons, landing on the right person, too late to save the man who had bought it. She closed the journal. She put her hand on Copper's head. The dog looked up at her with the brown, patient eyes of a creature who had buried a master and would not bury another without warning. "We are going to build a house," she said to him. He thumped his tail once against the floor. "If you've ever been told you were nothing, you know the moment I'm about to describe. The moment a woman stops grieving and starts building. Stay with me. We're going up that hill." The next morning, before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, Ingrid walked the 4 miles north out of Hollow Creek with Copper trotting beside her. She stood at the foot of the bone hollow scarp and looked up at the cold mouth. The cave waited at the top of the slope behind a curtain of thorny bramble. The wind ran across the loose shale without obstruction. The stunted junipers leaned south away from the weather like a row of bent old men trying to escape. She climbed. At the top, on a flat slab of rock outside the cave entrance, she found 3 things that had not been there when Magnus had measured this place 2 years ago. A pickaxe, a short-handled shovel, an iron chisel, all 3 sharpened with a particular angle. A 2-stroke whetstone technique that her grandfather Bjorn had used on every tool he had ever owned. a technique Magnus had carried home from Bergen and used on his own tools in the shed behind the Hollow Creek cabin. Someone who knew that technique had been here recently. Beside the tools drawn in white chalk on the surface of the rock was an arrow pointing into the cave, and beside the arrow a number, 2 degrees. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up the pickaxe, tested its weight in her hands, pushed through the brambles into the dark mouth of the cave, and got to work. That same week, in a small house on the south side of Hollow Creek, Doc Pemberton sat across from Ingrid in his examination room and folded his hands. Doc Pemberton was 61 years old, thin in the way of men who consider eating an interruption to thinking. He had delivered nearly every child born in this valley for the last 30 years. He had not delivered Eli. He had been called too late. Cordelia Ashbrook had seen to that. He looked at Ingrid over the tops of his spectacles. "Your lungs are weak," he said. "The premature delivery, the bleeding afterward, the fever. You are not strong. If you spend this winter in a cold, damp place or in a house full of smoke, I do not expect to see you in February. I am telling you a medical fact, not a prognosis." She nodded. She had known. Her chest had told her every morning for 3 weeks. He paused. He removed his spectacles. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Magnus came to see me 2 weeks before he died." Her hands went still in her lap. "He asked me a strange question. He asked whether a mother with weakened lungs and a newborn child could survive a Dakota winter underground. He had theories about air exchange, about humidity, about steady temperature. Very precise theories." Doc Pemberton put his spectacles back on. "I told him I did not know. No one had ever asked me before." He stood up. He walked her to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "He found his answers, Mrs. Thorvald. I am certain of it. The mind took him before he could use them. I think he left you the means to finish." She did not trust her voice. She squeezed his hand once and walked out into the street. The earth did not want to be moved. That was the first lesson, and Ingrid learned it the way every important lesson is learned. Through the slow education of consequence. The floor of the cave was not soil. It was compressed history. Layers of clay and shattered rock fused together under the weight of a glacier that had retreated before the first human ever stood on this continent. Every swing of the pickaxe sent a shock up the handle that arrived in her shoulders as a flat declaration. "I have been here 10,000 years. I am not interested in being moved." She swung it anyway. 12 hours the first day, 14 the second. Her hands bled through her gloves by noon on the third day. She wrapped them in strips torn from one of Magnus's shirts and kept swinging. Copper sat at the cave mouth on a flat rock and watched her with the steady attention of a dog who understood that his job was witness. On the morning of the 4th day, she arrived at the trench before dawn, lifted the pickaxe from where she had leaned it against the wall the night before, and found 2 additional feet of fresh-cut earth that had not been there when she went to sleep. She crouched at the edge of the new section. The work was careful, competent. The pickaxe strokes had the same angle as the strokes she had been making, the same rhythm, the same understanding of where to set the point of the tool to use the natural fault lines in the till instead of fighting them. She stood up. She looked out at the dawn. Nothing moved on the scarp. She picked up the pickaxe and continued from where the unknown hand had stopped. This happened 4 more times over the next 3 weeks, always in the hours before she woke. Always exactly 2 feet. Never a note. Never a sign. She did not tell anyone. She understood without thinking it through that to name the helper would be to require a conversation she was not yet ready for. The work was being done. That was the truth that mattered. Bess Linwood came to the creek below the scarp on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week. She was 36, the schoolteacher's wife, soft-faced. She stood on the opposite bank with a cloth bundle in her arms and the expression of a woman who had argued with herself the entire walk up and had lost the argument. "My husband doesn't know I'm here," she said across the water. "He would be angry." She thrust the bundle across, wool yarn, a tin of lard, half a loaf of that morning's bread. Ingrid's first instinct was refusal, clean and absolute. The wall of self-sufficiency she had built around herself was load-bearing. Taking charity felt like removing a stone. Then she thought of her own shoulders, the cough that had started in the 3rd week, the way her hands shook now in the evenings when she tried to write in Magnus's journal. She took the bundle. "Thank you." Bess's face relaxed. "I watch you from my kitchen window every morning. I have never seen anyone work like that, not even the men in the mine." She turned and walked back the way she had come, a woman returning to the approved world before it noticed her absence. Ingrid stood at the creek with the bundle in her arms, and something locked in her chest, locked since the morning of the empty coffin, did not break open. Nothing so dramatic. But it moved. The way a door moves when the house has settled quietly almost by accident, just enough to admit a fraction more light. Ezekiel Hardy came on the 7th day with a mule-drawn cart loaded with Douglas fir. He was 52 years old, built solid through the shoulders, with the hands of a man who had spent 30 years in the carpentry trade. He walked beside the cart instead of riding it. Ingrid noticed that. A man arriving on foot was a man arriving as a peer, not as authority. He removed his hat. "Mrs. Thorvald." She straightened from the trench, mud to her elbows, hair stuck to her forehead. "Mr. Hardy." He looked at the trench. He looked at the cave mouth. He looked at the spoil piles rising on either side of the cut. He looked at Copper, who was watching him with the steady neutrality of a dog who reserved judgment. "I came," Ezekiel said, "because of a family I knew once, in the next valley, the winter of '79. They tried to build a fire inside a shallow cave. The smoke had nowhere to go. I was the one called to bring out the bodies in the morning. The youngest was 6 years old. Same age as my Will now." He let that sit. "What you are building here will kill you, Mrs. Thorvald. I have brought you good lumber. I will help you build a proper lean-to against the south face of the rock. A real stone fireplace, something that works." Ingrid set down her pickaxe. She walked to the cave mouth. She gathered a small handful of dry juniper needles she had been saving for exactly this conversation. She placed them in the firebox at the near end of the trench. She struck a match. The needles caught. Ezekiel watched. The smoke did not rise. It did not billow into the cave. It was drawn downward into the stone-lined trench with a low, resonant sound, like a long, slow intake of breath. Both of them watched it disappear. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "That is wind. That is just the wind. That is a pressure differential," Ingrid said. Her voice was quiet. "The air in this cave is colder than the air at the far end of the chimney shaft outside. 40 feet of horizontal passage gives the draft more pull than any vertical chimney you have ever built. Your fireplaces lose 90% of their heat up the flue. They pull cold air in through every gap in your walls to replace the warm air they push out. You are not heating houses, Mr. Hardy. You are heating the sky." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is poetry. My grandfather spent 50 years reading this kind of stone in Norway. My husband spent 18 months learning from him. I am reading their notes." He looked at her. He looked at the trench. He looked at the smoke that was not there. He put his hat back on. "I will leave the lumber." He said it with the gravity of a man who believed he was saying it as a kindness to her future grave. He walked back down the slope. Ingrid watched him go. Then she picked up the first board of Douglas fir and carried it into the cave, because she was going to need every plank of it. Not for the lean-to he had imagined, but to seal the cave entrance he believed would kill her. By the end of the 3rd week, the trench was 35 feet long. The chimney stack at the far end stood 3 feet of careful stonework. The system, even incomplete, was beginning to demonstrate itself. When Ingrid lay on her bedroll at night, she could feel through the wool the first faint warmth rising through the cave floor. The town knew. Word traveled the way. Word travels in a town of 400 souls. Judge Vance heard. Reginald Ashbrook heard. Cordelia heard. They called it the Thorvald Folly. They called it the Burrow. Hattie Linwood Bess's sister-in-law, and the woman who carried news the way the postal service carried mail, told the women at the dry goods store that the Norwegian girl had lost her wits to grief, that she was digging her way to her dead husband, that the winter would settle the question soon enough. Father Caldwell, the new Episcopal priest the Ashbrooks had brought in from Boston 2 years ago, gave a sermon that Sunday on the dangers of clinging to the old country. He did not name Ingrid. He did not need to. Reginald Ashbrook rode up the slope on a Thursday afternoon. He sat his bay gelding at the foot of the scarp for 10 minutes, looking up at his son's widow shoveling shale onto a spoil pile. Then he turned the horse and rode back down without speaking to her. The message he carried back to his wife at the dinner table that night was a single sentence. She is going to die up there, and we will not have to do anything. Cordelia did not reply. She cut her meat. Jasper Brennan came in the dark on a night in late October. He had a bottle of whiskey that was mostly empty by the time he reached the top of the slope. He moved with the unsteadiness of a person whose legs had not been consulted about a decision the rest of him had already made. He stood over the chimney stack at the far end of the buried flue. Through the thin soles of his boots, even through the whiskey, he could feel the warmth rising from the earth beneath his feet. Stored heat from 35 feet of stone-lined flue radiating up through the packed soil as gently and steadily as breath. The system was working. He kicked the stack, once testing, twice harder. The third time was something else. The third time came from the place in a person where unexamined hurt lives. The place that has been told its whole life that visibility is the price of usefulness, and that to be refused by a woman is to be erased by her. The stones scattered, the clay joints cracked. 2 days of careful stonework collapsed into rubble in the dark. He stood over what he had done and waited for relief. It did not come. What came instead was a hollowness so complete it had its own weight. He sat on a rock for a long time, until the whiskey bottle ended up broken somewhere near his boot. When he walked away, his prints pressed deep into the soft earth beside the wreckage, the distinctive tread of a specific pair of boots sold from a specific inventory. Ingrid found the destruction at first light. She stood before it for a long moment. Her hands trembled. The trembling was not from cold. Copper stood beside her, his ears flat against his skull, his low growl directed at no enemy he could see. She looked at the boot prints in the soft earth. She looked at the broken bottle. She read the partial label. She understood what she was looking at. She did not say his name. Not yet. She picked up the pickaxe and began clearing the debris. That afternoon, she walked into Hollow Creek and through the door of the Brennan General Store. The bell rang. Jasper looked up from a nail bin. Something passed across his face, not guilt in any simple form. The more complicated expression of a person bracing for an impact he believed he had earned. "I need wire," Ingrid said, "and hinges. I will pay with labor. 1 day in your stockroom." He blinked. "I thought you didn't need anyone." "I do not need charity. I am buying supplies." She worked his stockroom for 8 hours the next day. Organized inventory with the same precision she brought to everything. Jasper found himself unable to stop watching her from behind the counter. The polite, business-like neutrality with which she treated him was worse than anger would have been. It communicated clearly and without negotiation that she had seen what he had done, had understood what had driven him to do it, and had concluded that he did not merit the energy of her contempt. She left without referencing the chimney stack. The bell over the door rang once behind her as she stepped into the street. She rebuilt the stack in 2 days. This time the stones went into a trench cut below grade set in clay at a depth no casual boot could reach. She laid heavy flat rocks across the top as a second layer of protection. When it was done, she pressed both palms against the surface and felt nothing move. If you've ever had something you built broken in the night by a man who could not bear that you did not need him, raise your hand wherever you're listening. I see you. Keep listening. The mountain is not done with him yet. The crisis arrived on the morning of November 2nd. Ingrid had been excavating the final 5 feet of the trench near the chimney connection. The pickaxe broke through a layer of gravel and water began to seep in. Not a rush, nothing dramatic in the first moments, just a slow, insistent upwelling from below, as if the earth had been waiting patiently for this exact moment to reveal what it had been holding in reserve. She watched the water level rise. Within an hour, 2 inches stood in the bottom of the trench. She crouched. She read the situation the way her grandfather Bjorn had taught her to read a flooding shaft. Not with panic, with understanding. Water in the flue meant steam. When the hot gases passed through, steam meant heat dissipating into humidity instead of transferring into stone. The thermal system, all 38 feet of it now nearly complete, would fail to function. Not partially, entirely, because the fundamental mechanism of conductive heat transfer required that the medium remain dry. She had planned for compacted earth. She had planned for embedded granite. She had not planned for a hidden seam of groundwater sitting beneath the gravel layer at exactly the point where the final section of flue needed to run. She sat down in the trench with her legs in the cold water and her wrists on her knees. For the first time since the plan had assembled itself in her mind 6 weeks ago, the architecture of her determination developed a crack. Not a collapse. A crack. Copper came to the edge of the trench. He whined once. He lay down at the rim with his chin on his paws and watched her. She opened Magnus's journal. She turned to the page near the back where ink had run long ago in some accident. She did not know the cause of blurring the text into a gray wash she had never been able to read. She tilted the journal at an angle. She positioned it so the thin afternoon light coming through the cave entrance struck the surface at a shallow rake. The way light reveals topography on a map by catching the edges of small elevations. The letters emerged from the blurred ink like shapes rising from fog. Grad gulvet ved to greater, van fyljer tyngdekraft ikke hopp, Norwegian. Magnus had written it in Norwegian. She translated out loud into the cave. Grade the floor at 2 degrees. Water follows gravity, not hope. The number sat in her chest like a struck bell. 2 degrees. The chalk mark on the rock outside the cave entrance on the day she arrived. The arrow pointing inward, and the number she had not yet had the context to understand. Someone had tried to warn her before she ever broke ground. She closed the journal. She looked at Copper. The dog lifted his head. Someone knew, she said to him. The solution was simple in the way good engineering is simple, not because it required little effort, but because it aligned with what the physical world was already doing instead of fighting it. A 2-degree slope in the floor of the trench, running from the firebox toward the chimney end, would guide any infiltrating groundwater downhill and out, where a narrow drainage channel cut along one side would carry it away from the system entirely. The difficulty was that implementing the fix required reopening every sealed section she had already completed. Every foot of work she had already done had to be done again better. She spent the next 2 days in a state of labor that moved past exhaustion into something else. Each section she reopened was a conversation with her past self, correcting errors she could not have known to avoid. When she made the final cut in the drainage channel on the afternoon of the second day and watched the accumulated groundwater begin to move slowly at first, then with the quiet conviction of something obeying a law instead of making a choice, she set down the shovel and walked out of the cave. She sat on the cold ground outside the entrance. The light was failing in the west. The valley below was filling with the early dark of November. The tears came without announcement, not from sadness. She was past sadness. They came from somewhere deeper, from the place where the body keeps track of what the mind refuses to count. Weeks of it. The empty coffin, the cough she heard in her own chest at night, the boot prints, the judge's voice using her maiden name, the specific loneliness of doing something no one around her believed was possible. I'm so tired, Magnus. The words came out small. addressed to the failing light and to the journal she had set down on the rock beside her. She did not hear the footsteps until they were close. She looked up. Silas Hawthorne stood at the edge of the firelight from her small cook fire. He was 65 years old. He held his hat in his hands. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been carrying something for 2 months and had finally arrived at the place where he could set it down. "Magnus came to me 3 weeks before the shaft collapsed," he said. Ingrid did not move. "He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to watch over you and the child. He gave me money to buy this land. He gave me his calculations. He told me to leave you the tools and the chalk mark and the 2 degrees. He told me you would understand the rest." Silas knelt slowly on the cold rock. He set something on the ground between them. A piece of red sandstone layered with dark veins of shale, small enough to close a hand around, worn smooth by the unconscious gesture of a man who had carried it in his pocket for 30 years. "He gave me this the week before the shaft collapsed. He told me to hold on to it. He said it was the future." Silas looked up. His face had aged 10 years in 2 months. "Mrs. Thorvald, the collapse was not an accident." The world went still. Magnus found something in his father's ledgers. The Ashbrook claim sits on land that belongs by treaty to a Lakota family that was paid for it in counterfeit script in 1875. Magnus was going to testify before the territorial court. The week before he went into that shaft, he told his father he intended to make the situation right. His father told him to think very carefully about his future. 3 days later, the timbers in the lower drift were inspected by a foreman who did not work the day shift. 3 days after that, the shaft collapsed during the only hour Magnus was in it. Ingrid did not breathe. "I cannot prove it in a court yet. I have the ledger Magnus copied. I have his letters. I have been waiting until you were strong enough to hear it. You are strong enough now." She picked up the sandstone. It was warm. The warmth of a thing that had been carried close to a body for a long time. She closed her hand around it. "They killed their own son. They killed their own son. And they took yours from you. And they were waiting for the winter to take you." Copper, who had been lying at her side, stood up. He walked to Silas. He pressed his head against the old man's chest. Silas placed one shaking hand on the dog's golden ears. "I was the one who helped you in the nights," he said. "I am sorry I could not say it sooner." Ingrid sat with the warm stone in her palm and the cold wind on her face. She understood for the first time the full shape of what had been done to her. And then very slowly she understood the full shape of what she was building. It was not a shelter. It was a witness. It was the evidence Magnus had not lived to deliver. It was the thing his parents could not bury because they did not know it existed. She stood up. "We have 9 days," she said. "The winter is coming. We will be ready when it does." Silas nodded. He picked up a shovel. The cave was sealed on the morning of November 9th. The wall across the entrance was built from the Douglas fir Ezekiel Hardy had left behind, supplemented by salvage planks from an abandoned storage shed in the next valley that Ingrid and Silas had disassembled and carried up the slope across 3 trips. Ingrid framed the opening with care. She left space for a door of doubled planks and a single small window, which she glazed with a piece of glass she traded a silver brooch for. The brooch had been a wedding gift from Magnus. When she set the glass into the frame, she did not look at it for a long time. She did not trust herself to. She built the first fire on the evening of November 10th. A small one, a handful of dry juniper. She placed the kindling in the stone firebox with the care of a person lighting something that had waited a long time to be lit. The match caught. The kindling took. The draw happened immediately. That low, resonant pull, the sound of the system working exactly as her grandfather had described it in the stone houses of Bergen 40 years before she was born. The smoke vanished into the earth as if the mountain were choosing to inhale. Not a wisp entered the room, For 3 hours, nothing else happened. She fed the firebox with measured additions, small amounts at precise intervals. Silas sat against the wall with Copper's head in his lap. The three of them waited in the specific silence of people who have bet everything on a principle they have never been able to fully test. Then late, well past dark, she lay down on her bedroll and pressed her palm flat against the stone floor. The warmth was there, faint at first. So faint it could have been wishful thinking. She moved her hand 6 inches along the buried path of the flue. The warmth was stronger there. Another 6 inches. Stronger still. 40 feet of red sandstone and shale charged by the passage of hot gases, radiating that charge upward through packed earth into the room above. The thermal battery her husband had designed, and her grandfather had taught her family to read, accepting its first full load and beginning slowly to pay it out. She lay with her palm on the warm floor and Copper curled against her side. For the first time since the morning of the empty coffin, she slept the sleep of a person who has finished a thing. Outside in the dark above the western ridge, the sky had begun to do something, slowly, patiently, the way every irreversible thing begins, without announcement, without the courtesy of gradual. If you've made it this far with me, I want you to take a slow breath right now, because what comes next is the part of the story that the town of Hollow Creek would tell for the next 100 years. The blizzard, and the woman they had buried before she could die. The morning of January 11th arrived like a confidence man, generous, persuasive, offering everything anyone wanted to believe. By noon, the temperature in Hollow Creek had climbed to 43 degrees. Children shed coats in the street. Men stood in saloon doorways with their faces turned up to the pale winter sun, talking about the Chinook coming off the western slopes, talking about an early spring, talking with the easy certainty of people who had survived enough winters to believe they could read them. Women opened windows that had been sealed since October. The whole town exhaled. Ingrid stepped out of the cave at midday and stood on the ledge above the valley. The warmth felt wrong. It was too generous, too sudden. The sky had the polished, depthless blue of a thing that was hiding something. She breathed in and identified the metallic edge in the air. Barometric pressure dropping faster than weather should drop it. Her grandfather had written about this in his notebooks. When the pressure falls like that, the world is preparing to become something else entirely. She went back inside. She checked the wood supply. 2 weeks of fuel stacked against the far wall. She checked every joint in the wall, pressing her fingers into the moss-packed gaps, feeling for drafts that were not there. She checked the chimney draw by holding a lit splinter near the firebox opening and watching the flame angle inward with steady conviction. She ran her hand along the buried flue stones, reading them through the packed earth the way her grandfather had taught her to read rock faces, looking for any change in temperature that might indicate a crack in the seal. Everything was ready. She did not know for what. She fed the fire. She sat down at the small table. She opened the journal. She closed it again. Outside, for the first time in weeks, the wind had gone completely still. The blizzard of January 12th, 1888 began at 1:15 in the afternoon. It would later be called the school children's blizzard, because it caught the school children walking home after the warm morning. It would kill more than 200 people across the northern plains. It would freeze cattle standing up. In Hollow Creek, the temperature dropped from 43 degrees to 23 in 5 minutes, to 0 in 30, to -27 in 2 hours and still falling, as if 0 were merely a landmark on the road to somewhere more serious. The wall of darkness that came down from the northwest had no precedent in most people's experience. It was not a cloud. It was a discontinuity, a hard edge between the world that had been and the world that was about to be. It hit the buildings of Hollow Creek as a physical force. A shutter tore from the front of the Brennan General Store with a sound like a gunshot. And then the snow came. And there was no longer any meaningful distinction between ground and sky. In the Hardy cabin on the south edge of town, Ezekiel fed 3 logs into the fireplace at a time. The fire roared with theatrical vigor, and 10 feet from its opening, the temperature was below freezing. His son Will lay on the cot nearest the hearth, wrapped in everything the house contained. He was 6 years old. He had woken that morning with a fever, unremarkable under normal circumstances. Under these circumstances, the fever had become something else. His breathing was shallow. His mother, Lydia, pressed a cloth to his forehead with hands that had developed a fine tremor she could not control. Ezekiel counted the woodpile. He did the arithmetic. The arithmetic said morning. Possibly. If the fire burned the way it was burning now and the storm did not intensify. After morning, the furniture. After the furniture, the floorboards. He looked at his wife. Lydia was watching him with an expression he had not seen in 20 years of marriage. Not accusation. The quiet, unbearable clarity of a woman who had done the arithmetic too. He thought for the first time about the cave at the bone hollow, about the smoke that had not risen, about the words he had said to her 3 months ago with his hat in his hands. That is poetry. He had been a master of his craft for 30 years. He had not been a master of anything. He had been a man who had mastered a limited approach to an unlimited problem. He stood up. He put on his coat. "Where are you going?" Lydia asked. He did not answer. He could not. He walked out into the storm. At the Brennan General Store, Jasper fed wooden crates into the pot-bellied stove. His father sat in the chair by the counter and coughed. The cough had been developing for weeks, a deep, wet sound that came from his chest, not his throat. Jasper heard it. He went still in the way he had gone still at 9 years old, standing in the doorway of his mother's room, listening to the same sound from a different chest. His mother had died of the same cough in the same chair in 1877. He fed another crate into the stove. He thought about the warmth he had felt through his boot soles on the night he had stood over Ingrid's chimney stack. The warmth that had been radiating from 35 feet of buried flue. He had known even then. He had known the system worked. He had broken it anyway. His father coughed. Longer this time. Jasper put on his coat. Inside the cold mouth, Ingrid was mending a tear in her dress. The storm arrived to her as sound. A low, sustained roar that had the character of weather, not as a condition, but as a new permanent state of the world. Through the sealed wall it was muffled, reduced to atmospheric pressure rather than specific noise. The candle on the small table burned straight. The air in the cave held still in the way of air that had been protected by more than walls, protected by mass, by 38 feet of stone that had been accumulating warmth for 2 months, and was now releasing it with the patience of something that did not experience urgency. Copper lay on the warm floor with his chin on his paws. His coat had thickened. He had not coughed once since the day they sealed the entrance. Ingrid set 3 small branches in the firebox. The draw took them with the low, resonant pull she had stopped noticing. The fire burned. The earth kept its end of the agreement. Silas, sitting in his corner, looked at her. "It sounds angry out there." "It is." She kept mending. Ezekiel Hardy fell twice on the trail up to the bone hollow. The first time he got up. The second time, he did not for a long moment. He lay in the drift. The whiteness around him had a quality his rational mind recognized with the part of his brain that stayed rational even when everything else was failing. The quality of comfort. It would be easy to stay here, not pleasant, easy in the way surrender is always easy. A hand closed around his collar. He looked up. Silas Hawthorne. The grip was not the grip of an old man. It was the grip of someone drawing on a resource that was not located in muscle. "Get up, Hardy." Ezekiel got up. They crested the final rise together. Ezekiel saw the chimney stack first, barely visible above the snow line. A small stone column that should have been buried, but was not because Ingrid had built it tall enough. Above the stack, a thread of warmth rising into the frozen air, barely visible against the blue-black sky. Behind the stack through the small window of the sealed cave entrance light. Not the emergency yellow of a fire struggling against cold, the steady warm amber of a controlled interior. Ezekiel raised his hand. He knocked. The door opened inward. The warmth that came through the opening was not a blast. That was the first thing his mind registered, because he had been expecting a blast. The aggressive exhalation of a space overheated against the cold outside. What came instead was an embrace. The kind of warmth that does not announce itself. It rose from the floor through his boots. It pressed gently against his face. It had the saturation of warmth that came from within the structure, rather than from any source he could point to. Ingrid stood in the doorway in a wool dress. No coat, no shawl. Her hands were not cracked. She looked at Ezekiel Hardy, the man who had told her in October that what she was building would kill her, with an expression that held none of the things he had been bracing himself to find. No triumph, no vindication, no satisfaction at being owed an acknowledgement. She looked at him the way you look at a person who is suffering and whose suffering you understand. He stepped inside. He turned slowly, his mind attempting to reconcile what his senses were reporting with the category of experience he had available for shelter. He pulled off his gloves. His fingers were white. He raised one hand and pressed his palm flat against the cave wall. The raw rock. The surface that, in any conventional understanding, should have been the coldest point in the room. It was warm, not dramatically warm, not unnaturally warm. Warm with the specific quality of a thing that had been warm for a long time and intended to remain warm. A deep structural warmth that did not come from a source you could point to. He kept his palm there. He did not turn around. His throat had developed a structure he could not navigate around. "My boy is sick," he said. "We have no more wood." The words came out in fragments. Ingrid did not make him wait. "Bring your family here. There is room. It is warm." She loaded the small sled from her wood pile, enough to heat the Hardy cabin to a survivable temperature for the time required to move the family. It was not a gift she could easily spare. Ezekiel took the rope at the door with his back to her, because he could not turn around and say the next part to her face. "You were right, Mrs. Thorvald, about all of it. 43 years I have built houses. 43 years I have been heating the sky. My boy is dying because I called you a fool while you built the only thing that could save us." He walked into the white. Lydia Hardy came through the door first that evening with Will in her arms. The boy's breathing was shallow and audible from across the room. His face was flushed the deep wrong pink of a child whose body had been entirely occupied with the work of fighting and had nothing left for the ordinary functions. Ingrid did not hesitate. She had been the daughter of a midwife once in Bergen. She had watched her grandmother Astrid bring children back from the edge more times than she could count. She laid Will on the warm stone floor. She stripped him of his wet clothes. She placed her palm on his chest and felt the heat coming off him. "The floor will pull the fever down," she said. "It will pull slow. That is what we want." Lydia knelt across from her. The two women did not speak. Lydia placed her hand over Ingrid's, and the two of them held the child between them on the warm stone. Ingrid began to sing very quietly, a melody her grandmother Astrid had sung to her when she was sick as a girl in Bergen. A simple repeating tune, a Norwegian lullaby with words about a goat on a mountain and a child sleeping in a field of stars. Will stopped moving against the floor. His breathing slowed. His hand came up and found the edge of Ingrid's sleeve. Then came the knock that broke the world open. It came at the door of the cold mouth late when the storm had been raging for almost 12 hours. Ingrid opened it. Cordelia Ashbrook stood in the snow. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her silk coat was ruined. Her face was wet with something that was not melting snow. In her arms, wrapped in a wool blanket that had cost more than most homes in Hollow Creek, was an infant, 4 months old. burning with fever, breathing in the shallow, rapid rhythm of a child whose lungs were giving up. Beneath the infant's left ear was a birthmark, a small crescent shape, the same birthmark Magnus Ashbrook had carried beneath his own left ear for all 26 years of his life. Eli. The world stopped. Ingrid did not move. She could not. Copper, lying behind her on the warm floor, lifted his head. He saw Cordelia. A low growl began in his throat, deeper than any growl he had ever made. Cordelia spoke. Her voice was not the voice of the woman who had said, "You are not an Ashbrook," across an empty grave 6 weeks ago. It was the voice of a woman whose pride had been broken by physics. He did not die. Ingrid did not speak. He did not die. We told you he died because we could not let an Ashbrook heir be raised by a Norwegian widow without standing. We had a wet nurse, a woman in the next county. We were going to keep him until he was old enough to forget. We had papers drawn. We were going to raise him as our second son. We had hired a girl from Boston to be the mother of record. Cordelia's mouth shook. Her arms shook. The storm came too fast. The fireplace cannot hold against this cold. The wet nurse rode here this morning before the worst of it with Eli because she did not know what else to do. She came to my door. "He has been like this for 2 days, Reginald said. Reginald said to wait until the storm broke. Reginald said. Reginald said. She could not finish. "Please." She held the child out across the threshold. "Please. He is your son. I know he is your son. Please." Copper's growl rose. Ingrid looked at Cordelia Ashbrook in the doorway of the cave that her husband had bought for her with the last $40 he had earned outside his family's money. The cave he had measured in secret. The cave he had calculated the air exchange for because he had known his mother's lungs were strong but his wife's were not, and he had known his son might come early and weak, and he had been building this for them, every line of it, every degree of grade, every inch of buried stone. He had been killed by his own family for trying to do one decent thing in his life that did not serve their copper. She looked at the boy in Cordelia's arms. The crescent. Magnus's crescent. She could have closed the door. She would have been within her right. She did not. "Put him down on the floor," she said. "Take the wet clothes off him. We have already done it once tonight. We can do it again." Cordelia's knees gave out. Lydia Hardy caught her before she hit the stone. If you are listening to this story right now, and you have ever held a child you were told was lost or wished you could, I want you to pause for just a moment. Take one slow breath. The next part of this story belongs to every mother who ever refused to stop believing. Stay with me. We are almost home. Jasper Brennan arrived an hour later with his father across his shoulders. His hands were bleeding through his gloves. He did not knock. The door was open. He brought his father to the warmest place along the wall, set him down gently, and then sat in the corner farthest from Ingrid and would not look at her. She brought him a tin cup of broth. He drank it with his face turned to the wall. She did not say anything. Some debts are not paid in words. They are paid in the slow, ordinary work of becoming a different person. By dawn on the second day of the storm, there were 17 people inside the cold mouth. The Hardy family, the Brennans, the Linwoods who had walked up the slope on the second night with Bess leading, and Hattie the gossip silent for the first time in the 8 years Ingrid had known her. Father Caldwell, who had come to deliver last rites to whoever was dying, and had found instead a Norwegian widow holding her own resurrected child against her chest. Doc Pemberton, who had been making rounds when the storm hit, and had been smart enough to come up the hill instead of trying to go home. Cordelia Ashbrook sat against the wall and did not speak for 2 days. She watched her grandson breathe. She watched her grandson live. She watched her daughter-in-law sing him to sleep in a language she had spent 4 years calling barbaric. On the third evening, when Eli's fever finally broke, and he opened his eyes and looked up at Ingrid and made the small, wet sound of a child, seeing his mother, Cordelia Ashbrook, put her face in her hands and wept. Nobody comforted her. That, too, was a kind of mercy. If you have ever lost a child, or thought you had or held a child you were told you would never hold again, I do not need to tell you what Ingrid felt that night. I will not even try to describe it. There are not words for it in any language I know. I only ask you, wherever you are listening, to put your hand over your own heart for a moment. For her. For yourself. For every woman who has ever been told her child was gone and has refused to believe it. The storm broke on the morning of January 15th. The temperature outside stood at 20 degrees below zero, under a sky so clear and cold it looked polished. The valley below the scarp was remade. The familiar geography of Hollow Creek reduced to a white abstraction, interrupted by rooftops. Silas Hawthorne walked down to town the next day with the ledger pages Magnus had copied 2 years ago wrapped in oilcloth inside his coat. He walked them to the territorial marshal's office in the next county. He delivered them. He came back. The investigation took 6 months. Reginald Ashbrook was indicted on charges of fraud against a Lakota family in the spring of 1888. The case never reached a full trial. Because Reginald Ashbrook had a stroke in his study the night before the deposition and never recovered, he lived another 4 years, unable to speak, fed by a nurse, and Cordelia sat with him every evening because that is what she had been raised to do. Judge Vance resigned his position. He moved to St. Paul. He sold insurance. Cordelia Ashbrook, freed by her husband's silence in the spring of 1888, climbed the Bone Hollow slope on a Tuesday afternoon in April and stood at the door of the cave and asked her daughter-in-law if she might be permitted to see her grandson. Ingrid did not forgive her, but she let her in. Cordelia lived until 1909. In her last 2 decades, she walked up the slope every Sunday afternoon, regardless of the weather, to sit on a wooden bench Ingrid had built for her near the cave entrance. The 2 women rarely spoke. Cordelia would watch Eli grow. She would sometimes bring a small jar of honey or a length of good wool, and she would set it on the rock outside the door and not come in. The day Cordelia died, Eli was the one who closed her eyes. Ingrid did not attend the funeral, but she did not stop Eli from going. There is a difference between forgiveness and grace. Ingrid gave her son the second. She kept the first for herself. Jasper Brennan never married. He took over his father's general store after the old man's lungs finally gave out in 1893. He became, over the years, the quiet man behind the counter who knew every family's account and never raised a price during a bad season. He sent crates of supplies up the Bone Hollow slope 4 times a year for the rest of his life. He never put a note inside. Ingrid never sent one back. They understood each other in the way 2 people understand each other when neither one wants to say the words out loud. Hollow Creek did not forget that winter. It changed how people built. It changed how people spoke to one another. It changed who was listened to in the saloon on a cold afternoon when the wind began to turn. Old women like you and me, we know that some kinds of change arrive slow and some arrive all at once. This one arrived all at once, and the woman who had brought it never raised her voice. That spring, Ezekiel Hardy and Ingrid Thorvald built 4 more hillside houses on the north slope of the Bone Hollow for 4 families who had no other shelter. Each one followed Magnus's drawings. Each one used Ezekiel's carpentry above the rock line and Ingrid's thermal system below it. They argued the way 2 skilled people argue when they finally stop trying to convert each other. Ezekiel taught Ingrid about load-bearing frames. Ingrid taught Ezekiel about grade and draw and the difference between heating a house and heating the sky. By 1895, there were 19 houses built into the Bone Hollow scarp. By 1910, there were 31. The hollow became a small community of its own. People called it Thorvald Slope, then just the slope. Children grew up there who would tell their grandchildren that the floor in their grandmother's house had always been warm. Always. Even on the coldest mornings of the worst winters of the century. Hattie Linwood, who had once told the women of Hollow Creek that Ingrid was digging her own grave, became the woman who walked new arrivals up the slope to meet the Norwegian widow. She told a different version of the story every time. By 1900, she had told it so often that she had come to believe she had always supported it. Father Caldwell preached a sermon in 1891 in which he said, without naming her, that some women come into this world to teach us the difference between the warmth we earn and the warmth we make. The sermon was the last good sermon he ever gave. He died the next winter of the cough. Doc Pemberton lived to be 89. He delivered 6 more children of Ingrid's after Eli. He delivered them all on the warm floor of the Cold Mouth, the original cave, which Ingrid kept as her family's main house for the rest of her life. She never married again. Magnus had been enough. Copper lived for 11 more years. He died on a Tuesday morning in October of 1898. He was old. He had been slowing down for a year. He died curled in his usual spot near the firebox, with his chin on his paws, in the warmest place in the house. Eli, 11 years old, then sat with him through the last hour. Ingrid buried him under the flat slab of rock outside the cave entrance where she had once found a chalk arrow and a number she had not yet understood. She did not carve his name into the stone. She did not need to. Eli grew. He grew into a quiet boy, then a quiet young man. He read his father's journal so many times he could recite the Norwegian passages by heart before he could fully understand them. He apprenticed under a mining engineer in Helena, Montana, and came home at 23 to begin documenting his mother's methods in the first of what would become 7 leather-bound notebooks. He filled them slowly, year by year, the way a man fills a thing he intends to last. He married a Norwegian girl from Minneapolis in 1912. They had 3 children. The eldest, a daughter, became an architect. Eli's notebooks would later be preserved by that daughter, who gave them to a regional historical society in 1971. They sat undisturbed in a wooden box for almost 2 decades. In 1989, a research team studying pre-industrial passive heating found the box. They spent 3 winters measuring the original cold mouth structure with modern instruments. What they recorded surprised them. The interior maintained an average temperature of 66 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the worst weeks of January, while outside temperatures dropped to 30 below. The fuel consumption was less than 1/3 of a conventional fireplace from the same era. The principles they wrote in their final report predate by half a century what modern engineers call passive solar geothermal architecture. They had been buried in a Norwegian widow's notebooks, and before that in the memory of an old man in Bergen who had taught a 7-year-old girl to press her cheek against a wall of ancient stone. Years later, after the railroad came through the next valley, after the territory became a state, after the world entered a new century, and then a war, and then another war, an old woman with white hair and very straight shoulders sat on a wooden chair outside a cave on a north-facing slope above what used to be Hollow Creek and waited. She was 83 years old. A young man from a college in the eastern part of the state had come to interview her. He was writing a paper about frontier-era heating systems. He had heard rumors about a place in the Dakota Hills where the floors stayed warm without modern heating in old structures that predated electrification by half a century. He had brought a notebook. He had brought questions. Ingrid Thorvald, born in Bergen, Norway in 1863, widowed at 24, told him the story slowly in the order it had happened. She did not embellish. She did not soften. She did not skip the boot prints in the soft earth, or the empty coffin on the hill, or the moment when the door opened on the night of the storm, and her son came back from the dead in his murderous grandmother's arms. The young man wrote everything down, his hand cramped. He kept writing. When she finished, he closed the notebook. He looked at the woman in front of him for a long time. "Mrs. Thorvald, may I ask one last question?" "Yes." "What kept you going through the digging, through the sabotage, through the night you thought you had lost the system to the groundwater? What kept you going?" Ingrid Thorvald looked out across the valley. The sun was setting on the western ridge. The light was the color of old copper. She thought about her grandfather Bjorn in the stone houses of Bergen, about the cold cheek of a 7-year-old girl pressed against a wall 1,000,000 years old, about a husband who had measured a cave in secret because he had been planning a future he would not live to see, about a dog who had not left her side, about a son who had a crescent under his left ear. "The mountain does not fight the cold," she said. "It remembers the warmth. My husband wrote that to me in the last words of his journal in Norwegian. I read them by accident 10 years after he died when the light fell on the page a certain way." She paused. "He wrote Ver fjellet min kjære, be the mountain, my love." The young man wrote it down. He thanked her. He walked down the slope. Ingrid sat in her chair until the sun was below the ridge. Eli came out of the cave and put a wool blanket around her shoulders. He was 59 years old then, a mining engineer with his father's hands and his mother's patience. "Mama," he said, "come inside. It's getting cold." "In a minute, Vesle gut." Little boy. She still called him that. She would still call him that the day she died. He went back inside. She sat for one more minute on the slope above the valley where she had been told 60 years before that she was nothing. The chimney behind her released a thin thread of warmth into the cold blue evening. It had been doing so without interruption for 60 winters. She closed her eyes. The mountain was warm at her back, and somewhere deep in the stone beneath her, the heat her husband had taught her to build was still, after all these years, paying itself out. Ingrid Thorvald died on a Sunday morning in March of 1949. She was 86 years old. She died in her own bed, on the warm stone floor of the cold mouth, with her hand on the rock that had been holding warmth for her family for 62 winters. Eli was beside her. Her 4 grandchildren were beside her. The fire in the firebox burned low and steady the way she had taught them to burn it. Her last words spoken in Norwegian were too quiet for anyone to catch all of them. What Eli heard and what he wrote down later in the last page of his 7th notebook was this: "Fjellet husker. Det husker oss alle. The mountain remembers. It remembers us all." If this story moved something in you tonight, I want you to do one last thing for me. I want you to think of the women in your life who built something that nobody believed in. Your mother, your grandmother, yourself. The ones who were told at some grave or some hearing or some doorway that they were not enough. Tell them the next time you see them that you remember what they built. And if they are gone, tell their names out loud into a warm room on a cold night. That is how the mountain remembers. That is how we all do. Good night.